What would you do if the very children you sacrificed everything for, your tears, your pride, your legacy, sold the land you built with your own hands, without so much as asking? Many of us spend our lives giving, believing loyalty will be returned, but sometimes the deepest wound comes not from strangers, but from the people we raised. Let me tell you what happened the evening I came home from town, only to find strangers walking across my farm as if it already belonged to them. The sun was dipping low behind the hills when I turned my truck down the old gravel road that led home. Dust rose in the rearview mirror like smoke, golden in the evening light. I had a sack of flour and a box of nails on the seat beside me, the kinds of simple things a man like me always brought back from town. Nothing in that cab told me my world was about to shift forever. But as the farmhouse came into view, I noticed something strange: shadows moving across the yard. Unfamiliar figures walking where no stranger had a right to be. Two men stood near the barn, one pointing at the roof as if inspecting it, the other jotting something in a notepad. Their clothes were too clean, their shoes too polished for farm work. A third leaned against a white pickup, smoking, staring at the corral like he was already deciding what it was worth. My chest tightened. I pulled the truck to a stop, dust clouds swallowing the air, and stepped out slowly. "Evenin'," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The man with the notepad looked up briefly, gave me a curt nod, and went back to scribbling. No respect, no introduction. Just the kind of glance you give at something that doesn't matter. I clenched my jaw and walked closer. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The one with the cigarette flicked his ash into the dirt. "Just looking around. Property inspection." Inspection? I felt my stomach drop. "This is my land. My farm. You don't just wander onto it without so much as a knock." The man with the notepad finally spoke. His voice clipped and rehearsed. "We were told it's been sold. Closing paperwork's nearly done. Buyers sent us to evaluate before final handover." My ears rang as if the words had been shouted inside my skull. Sold? Sold? The barn behind him blurred in my eyes. The oak tree swayed like a ghost. I shook my head hard. "There must be a mistake," I whispered. "This land's been in my family since my father bought it in 2052. I never signed no papers giving it away." The man shrugged, indifferent. "Take it up with your family, sir. We just do the inspection." My family, my children. A cold wind passed through me, colder than any winter I'd known. Images flashed: my sons leaning over documents at the kitchen table, telling me it was just tax adjustments. My daughter's smile that never reached her eyes when she slid the pen toward me. Had they? No, it couldn't be. But the evidence was standing right there, wearing polished boots and writing down the worth of everything I had built with my hands. I gripped the doorframe of the barn to steady myself. The smell of hay, of earth, of years of sweat and sacrifice filled my lungs, like it was all trying to remind me this place was mine. Yet strangers stood on it, measuring, appraising, like vultures circling something already dead. I forced myself to speak, though my throat was dry. "You'd best leave until I get this straightened out. This farm isn't gone. Not yet." My voice cracked, but there was steel in it still. The man flicked his cigarette into the dirt, gave me one last look, and climbed into the white pickup. The others followed. Engines roared, gravel spat, and then I was left alone, standing in the yard that suddenly felt foreign. I looked at the house, its windows glowing warm in the dusk, and I knew with a sinking certainty that something terrible had been done behind my back. My children, my own blood, had set this betrayal in motion. And tomorrow I was going to find out just how deep it went. I hardly slept that night. The walls of the farmhouse, once a comfort, felt like they were closing in on me. Every creak in the floorboards reminded me of my late wife's steps, and every shadow on the wall whispered the same bitter word: sold. By morning, my hands shook as I poured coffee, though not from age. It was rage, disbelief, and fear all tangled together. My children had always been my pride, but now I wondered if they had become my downfall. Around 9, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. It was my eldest, Daniel, climbing out of his shiny new truck. He had that confident stride of a man who thinks the world bends for him. Behind him, my daughter Claire emerged from the passenger side, her arms crossed tight against her chest. No smiles, no greetings. just two people bracing for a fight. "Morning, Dad," Daniel said flatly, walking toward the porch. "We need to talk." I didn't invite them in. "Talk then," I said, my voice low but steady. Daniel glanced at Claire before speaking. "The farm's been sold. It's done. Papers signed. You don't have to worry anymore. We took care of everything." The words landed like stones in my gut. "You. What?" My voice cracked. "This land is mine. Your mother and I bled into this soil. You had no right." Claire lifted her chin, her tone sharper than her brother's. "Dad, you can barely keep up with the work anymore. You should be thanking us. The money from the sale will set you up comfortably for the rest of your life." "Comfortably?" I barked out a laugh that had no humor. "Comfort comes from walking these fields, from seeing calves born in spring, from knowing every nail in that barn I hammered myself. Do you think money replaces that?" Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice as if reasoning with a child. "It's just business, Dad. Farms don't make sense anymore. We got a good price. You'll be free of the burden." "Burden?" The word sliced deeper than any blade could. I took a step forward, locking eyes with him. "You call your father's life a burden?" For a moment, silence hung heavy. Even the cicadas outside seemed to hush. Then Claire muttered, almost under her breath, "You'll see it was for the best." I shook my head slowly. "Number, what I see is betrayal. You sold not just land, but every year of sweat, every memory of your mother's laughter in the kitchen, every promise I made to keep this family rooted. You've sold yourselves, and you don't even realize the cost." Their faces hardened, but neither spoke. They turned back toward the truck, leaving me on the porch with the weight of their decision pressing down like a storm cloud. I gripped the railing to steady myself, knowing this was only the beginning. Somehow, I needed to find out how they tricked me and just how much of my farm they'd already given away. The morning air was thick with dew, and the fog clung low over the fields as I walked out alone. My boots sank into the wet soil, the very ground that had carried me through decades of labor and loss. Every fence post, every crooked board on the barn, every tree along the fence line held a piece of me. And as I moved through it all, memories rose like ghosts, demanding to be remembered. I could still see myself at 22, standing beside my young wife, Mary, when we first set foot on this land. Back then, it was nothing more than a worn-out patch of soil in a weathered farmhouse with peeling paint. We had next to nothing, an old tractor that coughed more than it ran, a handful of chickens, and dreams bigger than the sky overhead. "One day, this place will feed our family," I told her, my hand resting over hers. She smiled at me then, her eyes shining with the kind of faith only love can give. And together, we built it, board by board, field by field. I remembered the long nights when money was tight, when I worked double shifts at the mill just to buy seed. How Mary would sit up with the lantern burning, mending my shirts, waiting for me to come home. And still, before the sun rose, I was back out here plowing, planting, praying for rain. Every callus on my hands was carved by those years. Every scar told a story. And somehow, through all that struggle, this farm grew along with our children. I could still hear their laughter when they were little, chasing each other through the rows of corn, their bare feet pounding the soil I worked so hard to keep fertile. I built them a swing on the oak tree by the pasture. Daniel once fell off and scraped his knee, and I carried him inside, his tears soaking my shirt. Claire used to sit on the porch steps with Mary, shelling peas and asking endless questions about how things grew. I used to tell them, "This farm is your inheritance. Not money, not things. This soil is part of who we are." And I meant it. I thought they understood. When Mary died, the silence in the house nearly killed me. But the farm saved me. It gave me purpose. It kept me moving when grief threatened to bury me. I raised those kids alone after that, pouring everything I had into keeping both them and this land alive. Nights when I wanted to break down, I walked the fields instead. I whispered to the crops, to the cows, even to the wind, telling myself I'd hold it together for them. Now, standing there decades later, I felt the sting of betrayal sharper than ever. They hadn't just sold land. They had sold my life's work, their mother's memory, the very roots that kept this family from drifting apart. And for what? Convenience? Money? The fog began to lift, the sun burning its way through. And as I looked at the horizon, I realized something. They thought they were taking away my foundation, but they had no idea how deep my roots went, and soon they were going to learn. I stood on the porch as the sun climbed higher, its light washing across the fields like an old photograph coming alive. Every corner of that land carried a story, and every story carried a promise one I had spoken over and over to my children since they were small enough to sit on my shoulders. That promise was as steady as the seasons, as unbreakable as the soil beneath our boots. Asterisk. One day, all of this will be yours. Asterisk. I could still hear the way Daniel's eyes lit up when he was 10, tugging at my sleeve after a long day of baling hay. Really, Dad? Even the barn? His little hands were covered in dust, his cheeks smudged with sweat, but his excitement was pure. I crouched down, wiped the dirt from his face, and nodded. Yes, son, even the barn, because this isn't just mine, it's ours. You and Claire will carry it on after me. Claire, softer than her brother but with a fire in her eyes, once asked me at bedtime, "But what if I don't know how to take care of it like you do?" I kissed her forehead and told her, "You don't have to do it like me, you just have to love it. The land will teach you the rest." She smiled that night like I had handed her the world. And in a way, I had. Through every season, harvests that overflowed and droughts that nearly starved us. I kept repeating the same words. I wanted them to know the farm wasn't just a piece of property. It was their heritage. Their mother's laughter was in these walls. My sweat was in the planks of the barn, and their childhoods were stitched into every acre. Asterisk. This land is your inheritance. Don't ever forget it. Asterisk. I'd remind them whenever we walked the fields together. I thought they believed me. I thought they carried that promise in their hearts. That was my mistake. I confused their silence for understanding, their nods for loyalty. Maybe somewhere along the way, the meaning of inheritance changed for them. Maybe it became about money in the bank, comfort without struggle, an easier life than the one their old man had built with calloused hands. But to me, it was never about comfort. It was about belonging. About knowing where your roots are when the world tries to pull you loose. That's why the thought of betrayal cut so deep, because it wasn't just the sale of land. It was the breaking of a promise I had carved into them since they were children. I leaned against the railing and looked out at the fields, the same way I had so many times when life felt too heavy. Only this time, the promise echoed back to me like a cruel joke. Asterisk. One day, this will all be yours. Asterisk. And as the wind stirred through the trees, a darker thought settled in. Maybe they had remembered the words but twisted them into something I never meant. It wasn't as if the betrayal had come out of nowhere. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that had started forming years ago. Thin lines of disrespect that spread slowly until they finally broke wide open. At the time, I brushed them aside, telling myself kids grow up, they change, the world changes. But those little moments, those stings I tried to ignore, were warnings I should have never overlooked. I remember the first time Daniel came home from college with a different tone in his voice. He had spent one semester studying business, and suddenly he walked through the front door like he was the one running things. We were fixing the tractor that day, grease on my hands, the sun burning down. I asked him to pass me the wrench. He sighed, rolled his eyes, and muttered, "Dad, you still fix things the old way. You should just sell this junk and buy new." The words cut sharper than he realized. I laughed it off at the time, telling him, "Son, if I sold everything old, we'd be left with nothing, including me." He smirked, but I could see the distance already growing in his eyes. Claire's change came quieter but no less painful. She used to love helping in the kitchen, baking pies with her mother's old recipes. But as the years went on, she started skipping family meals, calling the farm stuck in the past. Once, when her friends visited from the city, I heard her whisper to them as they stood on the porch, "Sorry it smells like cows here. My dad doesn't believe in modern living." They laughed, and she laughed with them. I stood in the kitchen doorway, pretending I hadn't heard, but the shame sat heavy on my chest. It wasn't the smell she was ashamed of. It was me. The signs grew bolder as time went on. At Sunday dinners, Daniel would check his phone more than his plate, smirking when I talked about crop rotations or weather patterns. "Dad," he'd interrupt, You don't understand how the real world works. Farming isn't a life anymore. It's a liability. I'd set down my fork, bite my tongue, and change the subject, because arguing only made the divide wider. One night still burns in my memory. It was harvest season, and I was out late, my back aching as I hauled in the last of the hay bales. I came inside to find Daniel sitting with papers spread across the table. He didn't look up when I entered, just muttered, "We need to start thinking about selling this place before it collapses." I stood there, sweaty, tired, straw clinging to my clothes, and asked softly, "And what about the promise? The inheritance your mother and I built for you?" He finally looked up, and the coldness in his eyes was something I'll never forget. "Promises don't pay bills, Dad. Times have changed." That night, I lay awake hearing those words echo, and a knot of unease twisted in my gut. I didn't know then how far they would go. I didn't know they were already planting seeds of betrayal in the soil I had fought my whole life to keep alive. But the signs were there, and I ignored them. The argument came on a hot July afternoon, the kind of day when the air hangs heavy and every sound seems sharper than usual. I was mending a section of the fence near the pasture, sweat dripping down my temples, when Daniel pulled up in his truck. He slammed the door harder than he needed to and strode toward me with that restless energy I had come to dread. His tie was still loose around his neck from work, his sleeves rolled up like he was trying to play both businessman and farmhand at once. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, his voice clipped. I leaned against the fence post, wiping my brow with the back of my hand. "All right, son. What's so urgent you had to come storming out here?" He glanced around at the fields, at the barn in the distance, and shook his head like everything he saw was some kind of failure. "This place isn't sustainable anymore. You're wearing yourself out for nothing. I've been talking with a realtor, and—" I cut him off. "A realtor? Daniel, you went behind my back to talk about selling my farm?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice but not his arrogance. "It's not just your farm. It's family property. We all have a say, and it's time to face reality. You can't keep this up. Farming doesn't pay like it used to. You're nearly 70. You should be resting, not breaking your back." I stared at him, gripping the worn wood of the fence until my knuckles went white. "Resting? Son, this land is what keeps me alive. Every sunrise I see over these fields, every calf born in that barn, every crop that pushes through the soil, it reminds me I still have purpose. You don't take that away and call it mercy." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's not about mercy. It's about business. You don't understand how things work now. Property like this is worth more as development land than as a farm. We could make enough money to set you up comfortably and give Claire and me something for our futures." I shook my head slowly. "Your futures were supposed to be rooted here. Your mother and I gave our lives to build this for you. I promised you both this land would always be yours, not to sell, but to live on, to grow on, to belong to." He sighed, exasperated, like I was a child refusing to listen. "That's exactly the problem, Dad. You think promises are more important than progress." The heat rose in my chest, hotter than the July sun beating on my back. I stepped forward, meeting his eyes. "And you think progress is worth selling out your family's soul?" For a moment, we stood there, neither of us blinking, the distance between us wider than any field. Claire's car pulled up then, and she got out slowly, watching us with wary eyes. She didn't say much, just muttered, "Daniel's right, Dad. Things have to change." And that hurt even more. I turned away before they could see the sting in my eyes. My voice cracked, but I forced it steady. "If change means betrayal, then I want no part of it. You'll understand one day when the price you pay isn't in dollars, but in the weight on your conscience." But deep down, I feared they would never understand. And that fear was starting to come true. That night, the house was too quiet. Even the ticking of the old clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, like it was mocking me with every second that passed. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee I didn't want, staring at the dark window as though it might give me answers. Out in the yard, the crickets sang, the cicadas buzzed, and yet all I could hear was Daniel's voice echoing in my head. Asterisk, "You don't understand business." Asterisk. And Claire's soft but sharp words. Asterisk. "Things have to change." Asterisk. I rose finally, unable to bear the stillness inside, and stepped out into the night. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I crossed the yard. Moonlight spilled silver across the fields, lighting up the land I had fought for all my life. I walked slowly toward the barn, running my hand along the rough wood of the fence posts, as if touching them might tether me to something real. Each splinter, each groove told the story of years I had spent keeping this farm alive. Inside the barn, the sweet smell of hay mixed with the earthy musk of the animals. I leaned against a beam, listening to the soft shifting of the cows in their stalls. For years this had been my refuge, the place where I could breathe when the world seemed too heavy. Tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like I was the stranger, intruding on ground that was no longer mine. I swallowed hard against the bitterness rising in my throat. I walked row by row, touching the tools hung neatly on the wall. The scythe my father had passed down to me, the hammer that built the chicken coop, the shovel that had buried my wife's favorite dog under the oak tree. Memories pressed against me like shadows, each one reminding me of what I stood to lose. My chest tightened until I thought it might burst. I stepped outside again, staring at the stretch of fields glowing under the moonlight. I imagined surveyors marking it up, strangers in suits deciding what piece of my land would be flattened first, which tree would be torn down, which fence post would be uprooted. The thought sickened me. To them it was numbers on a page, but to me it was life itself. I sank down on the porch steps, burying my face in my hands. Silent humiliation burned through me. To know that my own children saw all this, saw me, as nothing but an obstacle to be moved aside. That they could smile at me across the table while plotting to strip away the only thing I had left. My wife's picture still hung in the hallway, smiling like she believed in us. I couldn't bear to look at it. The night stretched on, heavy and endless. I told myself I would not cry, but my eyes stung anyway, not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of betrayal. And in that silence I realized something painful and certain. They hadn't just sold the land. They had sold me. And worse, I had let them. The next morning, I found myself staring at the drawer in the kitchen where I kept all the important papers. My hands trembled as I pulled it open, rifling through envelopes, old bills, tax records. A knot twisted in my stomach. Deep down, I already knew. My children hadn't marched onto my land with strangers. By mistake, they had found a way to make it legal. And if they had, it meant I had been the one who gave them the weapon. I spread the papers across the table, the wood scarred from decades of family meals and midnight talks, receipts from the feed store, insurance forms, property tax bills. Then my eyes landed on it, a stack of documents with my signature scrawled at the bottom. I picked one up, squinting at the fine print, and felt the blood drain from my face. The heading read, Transfer of Limited Ownership Rights. Asterisk. My breath caught. I remembered the night Daniel slid those papers across this very table. He had poured me coffee, smiled that practiced smile, and said, Dad, this is just for taxes. We need to streamline things to protect the farm. Don't worry, it's still yours. I had trusted him. I hadn't even put on my glasses, just signed where he pointed. Now the truth glared back at me in black ink. I hadn't signed to protect the farm. I had signed away pieces of it. Not all at once, but enough that they could twist the rest to their advantage. Each line was a trap, each clause a chain I had shackled myself with, believing my children were looking out for me. I sank into the chair, the paper trembling in my grip. My chest ached not from age, but from shame. How could I, a man who spent his life reading weather signs in the sky, counting calves by lantern light, and fixing broken fences with nothing but wire and grit, how could I have been blind to the storm inside my own house? The front door creaked. Claire stepped in, carrying a folder tucked under her arm. She froze when she saw the papers scattered across the table. Her eyes flickered with something fear, guilt, maybe both. What's this? I asked, my voice low and tight. She set her jaw, glanced at the documents, then back at me. Dad, it's for your own good. You can't keep this up anymore. Daniel and I, we're just trying to make sure you're taken care of. I slammed my palm against the table, the sound echoing through the house. Taken care of? By stripping me of the very thing that kept me alive? By tricking me into signing away my life? Her lips pressed into a thin line. You don't understand the world anymore. It's not betrayal, it's responsibility. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and realized I wasn't staring at my little girl anymore. I was staring at a woman who had convinced herself lies were kindness. And in that moment I knew, they hadn't just betrayed me. They had convinced themselves they were right to do it. And that was far more dangerous. That evening, I sat out on the porch, the paper still heavy in my hands. My head felt foggy, as if the ink itself carried poison. The gravel crunched, and soon I heard little footsteps running toward me. My grandchildren, Emma and Jacob, tumbled out of Claire's car, laughing and carrying the kind of energy only children can bring. They didn't see the storm brewing inside me. To them, Grandpa's farm was still the playground it had always been. "Grandpa!" Jacob shouted, waving a stick in the air like a sword. "We're pirates today. The barn is our ship." Emma giggled, trailing behind with a basket of dandelions she'd picked from the yard. Her eyes, bright as morning dew, landed on the papers scattered across the porch table. She tilted her head. "What are those?" I forced a smile, folding the documents quickly. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. Just some boring grown-up stuff." She frowned, not satisfied. "Mom said some new people are coming to live here. Are they going to take the animals too?" Her words hit harder than a hammer to the chest. I swallowed hard, my voice catching. "Who told you that?" "Mom," she said innocently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She said the farm is going to belong to other people now, and we might move to the city. But I don't want to move. I like it here, the trees, the cows, the smell when it rains." She plopped down beside me, her little hand brushing mine. "Don't let them take it, Grandpa, please." Jacob climbed the porch steps, his stick now forgotten. He leaned close and whispered, "Grandpa, why were those men walking in the yard earlier? They looked mean, like they didn't like this place." I stared at their faces so full of trust, of innocence, and my chest ached. They were too young to understand contracts, deeds, signatures, or betrayal. But they felt it. Children always feel when something sacred is slipping away. I pulled them close, one on each side, breathing in the scent of sunshine and grass still clinging to their clothes. "This is your farm too," I whispered, my voice breaking. "And I'll fight for it. You hear me? Grandpa won't let it go without a fight." They didn't understand the full weight of my words, but they nodded, satisfied with the promise. Emma rested her head against my shoulder, and Jacob ran off into the yard again, shouting at the cows to prepare the ship for sailing. I watched them play, the golden light of evening stretching across the fields, and my heart twisted. For years, I had promised their parents this land would be their inheritance. But now, watching those children run barefoot in the grass, I realized something more important. The true inheritance wasn't the land itself, it was the belonging, the roots, the connection to something that could not be bought or sold. And if I failed, if I let my children take it all away, I wouldn't just be losing my farm. I'd be stealing the legacy from the very ones who still believed in it. And that was something I could never allow. The next day I drove into town, the old truck rattling like it always did. But this time the sound felt heavier, like it carried shame along with it. I stopped at the feed store to pick up some seed, trying to carry on as if everything were normal. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt eyes on me. Conversations hushed, then started up again in whispers that clung to the air like dust motes in sunlight. Mrs. Thompson, who'd been running that store since her husband passed, greeted me kindly enough, but I caught the flicker in her expression, the look of pity folks give when they know something you wish they didn't. "Morning, Robert," she said, bagging up the seeds slower than usual. "Heard you've had some changes out at the farm." I forced a smile. "Farm always has changes, ma'am. Weather takes care of that." She nodded, but her eyes softened. "I suppose. Just if you ever need anything, you know where I am." Out on the street, I heard two men by the barbershop murmuring as I passed. "Shame what happened to old Robert. Kids sold the place right from under him." The other replied, "Can't imagine raising your children all those years just to end up like that." They didn't lower their voices enough, and each word landed like a stone in my gut. I kept walking, head down, but everywhere I went it was the same. The whispers followed me. The gas station, the diner, even church on Sunday. Folks weren't cruel. If anything, they were sympathetic. But pity can weigh heavier than scorn. It told me one thing clearly. The whole town knew I had been betrayed by my own blood. When I stopped by the post office, old Mr. Jenkins, a friend from way back, stepped out onto the steps. He placed a weathered hand on my shoulder and looked me dead in the eye. "Robert, I don't know what went wrong with those kids of yours, but I want you to remember you're not the fool here. You gave them everything. If they turned greedy, that's on them, not you." I nodded, but my throat was too tight to answer. I climbed back into my truck, gripping the steering wheel until my hands hurt. All my life, my reputation had been tied to that farm. People respected me because I worked hard, kept my word, and raised a family on honest soil. Now, with just a few signatures, my children had stripped that away not only from me, but from the way folks saw me. As I drove home, the whispers trailed after me like ghosts. For the first time, the farm didn't feel like a shield. It felt like a wound everyone could see. And sitting back on my porch that evening, I realized something else. The betrayal wasn't just about land or money anymore. It was about dignity. And that, I swore, I was going to take back. That night, the house groaned under its own silence. I lit a single lamp in the kitchen, its weak glow stretching across the wooden table where the betrayal papers still sat in a messy pile. I tried to read them again, hoping I had misunderstood, that maybe there was a loophole, a mistake, but every line was the same knife twisting deeper. My children hadn't stumbled into this by accident. They had planned it. And I had handed them the blade with my own pen. The air inside felt suffocating, so I carried the lamp into the living room and set it near the mantel. My wife's picture hung there, Mary, her smile frozen in time, eyes full of warmth that had carried me through storms harder than this. I stood there staring, whispering into the quiet. "What would you say to me now, Mary? Would you tell me to fight? Or would you tell me to let go?" My voice cracked on the last word. I half expected her to answer, but all I heard was the hum of the lamp and the beating of my tired heart. I lowered myself into the armchair, the one where I had rocked Daniel to sleep when he was just a boy, the one where Claire curled up beside me to hear bedtime stories about this very farm. Now that same chair felt like a throne of failure, a place where a father had lost his grip on the only thing he was meant to protect. I pressed my palms against my eyes, but the darkness only made the voices louder, Daniel saying, "It's just business," Claire whispering, "Things have to change." Each word carved a hollow space in my chest. Midnight came and went. I tried to distract myself with the radio, but every song seemed to talk about home, about love, about loss. I shut it off, letting the silence settle heavy once more. Even the animals outside were still, as if the entire farm knew it was being stolen piece by piece. I thought of the grandchildren asleep in their beds, unaware of the storm their parents had stirred. For their sake, I had to keep standing, but in that lonely hour, I felt like nothing more than an old man waiting for the world to pass him by. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, but wasn't strength either. It was the sound of a man caught between surrender and defiance. The lamp flickered, shadows shifting across the walls, and in those shadows I saw every sacrifice I had ever made, every blister, every drop of sweat, every promise. And I realized with a painful clarity I might have been fooled, but I wasn't finished. The night was long, but somewhere in the silence, a spark began to burn. Small, fragile, but alive. And by morning, I knew that spark would demand more than quiet endurance. It would demand action. The first light of dawn broke across the horizon, spilling gold over the fields. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold in my hands, staring at the land like I was seeing it for the first time. My body ached from another sleepless night, but my mind felt strangely sharp, like the silence had burned away something soft inside me. What remained wasn't weakness, it was resolve. For too long, I had let myself believe that age meant surrender, that maybe my children were right. Maybe I was too old, too tired to keep fighting for what I'd built. But as I watched the morning mist rise over the fields, a different truth settled in. This land wasn't just dirt and wood and fences, it was the proof of my life. And no piece of paper, no clever lie, no greedy child was going to take that from me. The spark that had flickered in me last night now burned like a steady flame. My wife's voice echoed in my mind, not in sorrow but in strength. Asterisk. Stand your ground, Robert. You've weathered worse storms than this. Asterisk. She was right. I had survived droughts that left the soil cracked, winters that froze the pipes solid, markets that nearly starved us. I had buried her, the hardest battle of all, and kept moving forward. If I could endure that, I could endure this. I set the mug down and rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from my back. No more, I whispered into the morning air. No more letting them decide who I am. My words were swallowed by the wind, but they felt solid, like nails driven into oak. As I walked toward the barn, the familiar smells of hay and soil filled me with a strange comfort. My father had once told me that the land remembers the hands that work it. I believed him now more than ever. This farm remembered me, every scar on my palms, every prayer whispered into its fields, and I knew if I had to, I would fight for it until my last breath. The crunch of gravel pulled me from my thoughts. A car door slammed. Daniel's truck again. He stepped out, phone in hand, already barking into it about deadlines and buyers. He glanced at me briefly and smirked, as if the farm was already gone, as if I was already beaten. But something in me had changed. I straightened my shoulders, met his eyes without flinching, and for the first time in years I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. He didn't know it yet, but the man standing before him wasn't the weary father who signed whatever papers they shoved under his nose. I was awake now, and I was ready. What Daniel didn't realize was that buried deep among those stacks of documents and deeds was a truth he had overlooked. And soon, I was going to find it. I spent the next day at the kitchen table, the papers spread out like pieces of a puzzle I was determined to solve. My glasses slipped down the bridge of my nose as I traced every line, every clause, every signature. Hours passed. The sun rose high, then began to fall again, casting long shadows across the floorboards. My back ached, my eyes burned, but I refused to give up. Somewhere in this mountain of ink and deception, there had to be something my children had missed. And then, in the fading light of afternoon, I saw it. It was buried in a clause so small it might as well have been written in whispers. Transfer of limited ownership rights. Subject to primary deed holder's consent for full execution. Asterisk. My breath caught. Consent. That word pulsed like a beacon. They had tricked me into signing documents that looked final, but without my explicit approval on the original deed, the sale couldn't be completed. I was still the primary owner. They hadn't stolen everything they had, only built a house of cards, one strong wind away from collapsing. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as relief and fury crashed together inside me. They thought I was blind, too old to see what they were doing. They thought ink on paper meant more than the man whose sweat had watered this land for decades. But they were wrong. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel snapped me out of my thoughts. Claire walked in moments later, carrying grocery bags. She froze when she saw the papers spread out across the table again. Her eyes darted to the clause I had underlined in red pen. She set the bags down slowly, her face paling. "You knew," I said quietly, holding her gaze. "You both knew this clause was here." She swallowed hard, her voice unsteady. "Dad, it doesn't change anything. Daniel said we could work around it. You don't have to make this harder than it is." I pushed the papers toward her, my voice firm. "Harder? You've already made it unbearable. You tried to sell the very soil your mother is buried in. And you thought I wouldn't notice this one line? You thought I'd just roll over and let you bury me too?" Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. She turned away, fiddling with the grocery bags like a child caught in a lie. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt strength returning to me not from anger alone, but from the truth I now held in my hands. The farm was still mine, the law was still on my side. I gathered the papers neatly into a folder, tapped them against the table, and looked at Claire with eyes that no longer wavered. "Tell your brother, this fight isn't over, not by a long shot." She opened her mouth as if to protest, then shut it again. Her silence told me everything. They hadn't expected me to find it, and as I watched her retreat into the hallway, one thought burned steady inside me. My children thought they had trapped me. But in their haste, they had left the key in my hand. The following morning, I drove into town with the folder riding shotgun on the seat beside me. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than they had in years. I wasn't heading for the feed store or the diner this time. I was heading for an office I hadn't stepped into in decades, the office of Charles Whitman, an old acquaintance who'd once handled property disputes for half the county. Charles was retired now, but his son David had taken over the practice. I hoped the apple hadn't fallen too far from the tree. When I walked through the glass door, the smell of paper and coffee hit me like memory itself. David looked up from behind his desk, his features so much like his father's it gave me pause. He stood, offering a firm handshake. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "my father always spoke highly of you. Please, have a seat. What can I do for you?" I lowered myself into the chair across from him, the folder heavy in my lap. "I need someone who still believes words on paper mean something, someone who won't dismiss an old man because of his age." David leaned forward, his tone respectful. "You came to the right place. Tell me what's going on." I opened the folder, spreading the documents across his desk the same way I had done on my kitchen table. My voice shook at first, but then steadied as I laid out the story. How Daniel and Claire had brought me papers disguised as tax forms, how they tricked me into signing, how strangers had already been walking my land as if it were theirs. And finally, I pointed to the clause I'd underlined in red. "This," I said, tapping it with my finger. "This is the thread holding their whole scheme together. Without my consent, the deed doesn't transfer." David studied the lines carefully, nodding slowly. "You're right. This clause is everything. They may have tricked you into partial agreements, but they don't own what they tried to sell. You do." He looked up at me, his eyes sharp. "And if they've already tried to pass it off to buyers, then we're not just talking about betrayal. We're talking about fraud." The word hung heavy in the air. Fraud. To hear it spoken aloud made my chest tighten, but also made my spine straighten. "What can I do?" I asked quietly. David gathered the papers into a neat stack. "First, we secure your rights. I'll draft a notice of ownership and file it with the county recorder today. That will freeze any attempted transfer until this is resolved. Then, we prepare for the worst. If your children try to fight, we'll have grounds for legal action. Elder exploitation, fraud, misrepresentation, you name it. But make no mistake, Mr. Hayes, you're not powerless, not at all." For the first time in days, I felt something rise in me that I thought had been buried for good hope. I gripped David's hand across the desk, squeezing tight. "Thank you, son. You don't know what this means." He smiled faintly. "Actually, I think I do. My father used to say men like you are the backbone of this county. If your kids thought they could pull the wool over your eyes, they're about to learn otherwise." I walked out of that office taller than I'd gone in. The whispers in town might have painted me as a broken old man, but now I carried a different truth in my chest. I wasn't broken. I was preparing. And when my children learned I had a lawyer standing at my side, the ground beneath them would start to shake. I drove back home with the folder tucked safe under the passenger seat, David's words still echoing in my ears. Fraud, elder, exploitation, legal action. Heavy words, but ones that gave me strength instead of fear. If this was going to be a fight, then I would fight it with everything I had left. And that meant one thing: gathering proof. The kitchen table became my battlefield. I cleared it off, set the lamp close, and pulled out every box, envelope, and binder I had stored in the attic and the back closet. Dust rose as I opened them, but inside was the story of my life: tax receipts, property deeds, utility bills, even photographs from harvest fairs decades old. Each piece of paper, each faded record, was another brick in the wall I was building to defend myself. I found the deed from 1972, when Mary and I had first signed for the farm. My hands trembled as I traced the ink, her signature neat and graceful beside my clumsy scrawl. That paper wasn't just ink and lines, it was the foundation of everything. I tucked it carefully into a folder marked Originals. Next, I uncovered years of property tax receipts. Paid, stamped, filed, each one proof that I had never let this land slip through my fingers. I remembered nights I'd skip dinner so those bills could be paid, times I'd taken odd jobs at the mill or fixed fences for neighbors just to cover the taxes. Every sacrifice was written right there in official ink. The photographs told their own story. Mary holding Claire as a baby on the porch, Daniel riding the tractor with me when he was no more than 5, family picnics under the oak tree by the pasture. Those pictures weren't legal documents, but they carried a weight no court could ignore, the weight of belonging. This wasn't just land. It was home. I worked late into the night, sorting, labeling, creating piles for David to use. Evidence of ownership, evidence of payment, evidence of family history tied to this soil. My back ached and my eyes blurred, but I kept pushing forward. With every paper I placed neatly into a folder, my shame loosened and my resolve tightened. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. For a moment, my heart jumped, thinking it might be Daniel or Claire, but when I opened it, it was my neighbor, Harold. He carried a flashlight and wore the same overalls I'd seen him in for the last 20 years. "Robert," he said, his face lined with concern. "Word's gone round about the farm. If you need me to testify about all the years I've seen you working this land, I'll do it." No hesitation. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Thank you, Harold. That means more than you know." He gave my shoulder a firm squeeze before walking back into the night. I stood there in the doorway, watching the beam of his flashlight fade, and I felt something shift deep inside me. I wasn't alone. By the time I finally closed the last folder, I had a mountain of evidence stacked high on the table. Proof that this farm was mine in every way that mattered, on paper, in sweat, and in memory. My children had signatures and excuses, but I had the truth. And tomorrow, I planned to put that truth directly in front of them. The morning sun had barely cleared the treetops when I called Daniel and Claire. My voice was calm, but there was iron beneath it. "Come to the house," I told them. "We need to talk. Today." They hesitated, but I didn't give them a choice. By noon, their vehicles pulled into the driveway, dust trailing behind them like shadows. I sat at the kitchen table, the very same table where they had tricked me into signing those papers. But this time, it wasn't bare. It was covered, edge to edge, with folders, deeds, receipts, photographs all neatly stacked and waiting. My armor. My proof. Daniel entered first, phone in hand, jaw tight with irritation. Claire followed, her eyes darting nervously at the papers spread across the table. Neither of them sat. They stood across from me like two strangers, not the children I had raised. "What is all this?" Daniel demanded, gesturing to the piles. I folded my hands slowly, steadying myself. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is 40 years of my life. Every bill I paid, every tax receipt, every deed signed in my name, every inch of this farm tied back to me." Claire's face paled. Daniel scoffed, leaning against the counter with false confidence. "Dad, you don't know what you're talking about. The sale is moving forward. It's too late." I pushed a folder toward them, the one with the red pen marks. "Is it? Because right here, buried in the fine print you thought I'd never read, is a clause. The sale can't be finalized without my consent. And guess what, Daniel? I don't give it." For the first time, his mask cracked. His eyes flickered, searching the page as if the words might vanish. "That's just technical language. It won't hold up." "It will." I cut him off sharply. "I've already spoken with a lawyer, a good one. And if you try to push this any further, it won't just be betrayal, it'll be fraud. Do you really want to stand in front of a judge and explain how you tricked your father into signing away his land?" Claire finally sank into a chair, her voice small. "Dad, we were only trying to help." I slammed my hand against the table, the sound making her jump. "Help? You call it help to sell the only thing your mother and I built with our bare hands? To turn our sweat and sacrifice into cash for your own comfort?" Silence filled the room. Daniel's jaw worked, his confidence slipping. Claire's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. For the first time, they weren't in control. I leaned forward, my voice low but heavy with years of weight. "You both forgot something. You thought my age made me weak. You thought these calloused hands were too tired to fight. But you underestimated me. This farm remembers me, and so will the law." Daniel tried to speak, but no words came. He looked at Claire, then back at me, his face pale. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes, not of me, but of the truth he could no longer deny. I sat back slowly, folding my arms. "Now sit down, Because from this moment forward, things are going to be different. The silence in that kitchen stretched so long you could hear the hum of the old refrigerator. Daniel finally dropped into the chair across from me, his phone still clutched in his hand like a weapon he couldn't use. His bravado was slipping, little by little, and what replaced it wasn't strength, it was panic trying to hide behind pride. Claire kept her head low, twisting her hands together in her lap. She looked smaller than I'd seen her in years, as though the weight of the truth I'd laid out had finally pressed her down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel let out a sharp breath. "So what now, Dad?" His voice was quieter than before, though he tried to lace it with sarcasm. "You going to take us to court? Drag your own children in front of a judge? Make the whole town watch?" I met his eyes, steady as stone. "If that's what it takes." His smirk faltered. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, and for the first time I saw doubt flicker across his face. He wasn't invincible anymore. He wasn't the clever son pulling strings in the shadows. He was a man cornered by the very parent he thought too weak to fight back. Claire's voice broke the silence, barely more than a whisper. "Daniel, maybe we should stop. Maybe Dad's right. We went too far." He snapped his head toward her. "Don't start that." His voice cracked under the pressure, betraying the fear he was trying so hard to hide. "We can still fix this. We just need more time." "Fix this?" I repeated, my tone cutting. "You call it fixing to keep pushing a lie? To sell what you had no right to touch?" I tapped the folder of documents with my finger. "No, Daniel. There's no fixing. There's only undoing." He tried to speak again, but his words stumbled. "Dad, you don't understand. We already put money down on other things. People are expecting—" He stopped himself, biting his lip, realizing he had said too much. I leaned in, my voice low and sharp. "So that's it, isn't it? You didn't just try to sell the farm. You've already spent what you don't even own." His eyes darted away, jaw tightening. Claire's tears finally slipped free, rolling down her cheeks. She buried her face in her hands, whispering, "This isn't what we wanted. Not like this." I looked at them both, my children, my own blood crumbling under the weight of their choices. The masks of confidence, of authority, of control, all cracking piece by piece, until what sat before me wasn't arrogance anymore, but fear and shame. I sat back slowly, letting the silence hang heavy. For years they had underestimated me, treating me like an old man too tired to stand his ground. But now, they couldn't hide from the truth. The ground they thought they'd stolen was still mine. And deep down, they knew it was starting to crumble beneath their feet. The days that followed were tense, like waiting for a storm you knew was coming but couldn't see yet. Daniel stopped by less, his phone calls shorter, sharper. Claire avoided me altogether, though I sometimes saw her car parked at the edge of town, as if she couldn't quite bring herself to face me again. I kept working the land as I always had, mending fences, checking on the livestock, walking the fields at sunrise. Outwardly, life went on. But beneath it all, I knew the battle was only beginning. Then, one afternoon, a black sedan rolled up the drive. A man in a crisp suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. He looked out of place among the dust and the rust of the farm, like a crow landing in a wheat field. "Mr. Hayes?" he asked, approaching with a measured politeness. "That's me," I answered, wiping my hands on a rag. "I'm Richard Calloway. I represent the buyers who were in negotiation with your children regarding this property." He opened his case, pulling out a stack of papers. "I came to discuss the complications that have arisen." I gestured toward the porch. "You'd better sit down then." We sat across from each other at the table. He laid out documents. I recognized copies of the same fraudulent agreements Daniel and Claire had shoved under my nose. But this time, the tone was different. "Mr. Hayes," he said carefully, "we've been informed that you never gave full consent for this sale. Is that correct?" I met his gaze steadily. "That's right. I never signed away my farm. And I never will." He nodded slowly, almost with relief. "That's what I suspected. Legally, the sale cannot proceed without your explicit authorization, which means our firm will be withdrawing immediately. We don't involve ourselves in deals built on shaky ground, especially when family betrayal is involved. A weight lifted from my chest. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first clear sign that the truth was on my side. The buyers were walking away, leaving my children with nothing but their lies. As Calloway gathered his papers, he looked at me with something almost like respect. I'll tell you this, Mr. Hayes. In my line of work, I see greed tear families apart every day. But it's not often the old man at the center stands his ground. You've done right, sir. Don't let them convince you otherwise. After he drove off, I stood on the porch, the wind carrying the scent of freshly cut hay across the yard. For the first time in weeks, the farm felt alive again, as if the land itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Inside, I knew Daniel and Claire were about to feel the weight of what they'd done. Their deal had collapsed. Their schemes were unraveling. And soon, the consequences would come knocking harder than they ever expected. News in a small town moves faster than wildfire. By the end of the week, everyone knew the buyers had walked away and that Daniel and Claire's big deal had collapsed. I didn't have to say a word. Neighbors filled in the story on their own, and pity had turned to something sharper. Disappointment. Disgust. At the diner, I overheard men at the counter shaking their heads. Sold out their own father and didn't even have the sense to make it stick, one muttered. At church on Sunday, Mrs. Thompson, the same woman who'd once looked at me with pity, now pressed my hand and whispered, "The Lord sees the truth, Robert." You stood firm. They'll have to answer for their greed. Her eyes carried respect, not sympathy. Meanwhile, Daniel couldn't escape the fallout. The contractor he'd been bragging to for weeks cut ties with him. The banker who'd once lent him money now wouldn't return his calls. I even heard he was facing debts he couldn't pay, debts he had taken out against money he never had. His shiny truck sat parked outside his house for days without moving, like a monument to his arrogance now rusting in the sun. Claire's shame was quieter but no less heavy. Friends she once laughed with in town no longer invited her. At the grocery store, she kept her eyes down, avoiding conversations, pushing her cart past whispers she couldn't silence. She visited once, standing on the porch with tears in her eyes. "Dad," she said softly, "I never meant for it to go this far." I listened but didn't answer. Sometimes silence speaks louder than forgiveness. What cut deepest for them wasn't just the financial mess, it was the loss of respect. In a town like ours, reputation is worth more than money, and theirs had been stripped bare for everyone to see. As for me, I walked the farm with a steadier step. Each sunrise seemed brighter, each chore lighter, because I knew I had stood firm. I hadn't been the helpless old man they thought they could push aside. I had fought, and I had kept what was mine. One evening I sat on the porch watching the fields sway in the wind. My neighbor Harold came by, leaning on the fence. "Looks like the tables have turned, Robert," he said with a grin. "Your kids thought they were clever, but now the whole town sees who the real fool is. And it ain't you." I nodded slowly, my eyes still on the horizon. They'll live with the weight of their choices. That's punishment enough. But as I spoke, I knew this wasn't the end. They had tried once. They might try again. And if they did, I'd be ready. Because the farm wasn't just soil and wood, it was my life's proof. And I wasn't about to let anyone take it from me, not even my own blood. The storm had passed, but I could still hear thunder rumbling on the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple as I walked the fields one last time that week. The evening breeze carried the smell of cut hay, rich and familiar, like an old friend wrapping its arms around me. I paused by the oak tree near the pasture, the same tree where Daniel once swung from a rope I'd tied, the same one where Claire used to sit with her mother, shelling peas. So many memories rooted in this soil, stronger than any contract or betrayal could ever erase. I leaned against the rough bark, letting my hand rest on its trunk. For a long while, I just stood there, listening to the cicadas hum, watching the shadows grow. This farm had carried me through my youth, my marriage, my grief, my fatherhood. It had carried me through betrayal too. And now, standing here after everything, I realized the farm had given me something my children had forgotten how to value: dignity. The town looked at me differently now. Not as a broken man tossed aside by his own blood, but as someone who had stood tall when most would have bent. My neighbors' nods were no longer pity, they were respect. And respect, I learned, is not given because of age or title. It is earned and it is defended, even when those closest to you try to strip it away. I thought of Daniel and Claire then, of the shame that weighed on their shoulders now. I didn't know if they would ever come to me in true remorse. Maybe one day, maybe never. That choice was theirs to carry. My burden, however, was lighter. I had fought for what was mine, not out of greed, but out of love. Love for the woman who once stood beside me here. Love for the grandchildren who still laughed in these fields. Love for the life I had built with my own hands. As the last light of day slipped behind the hills, I whispered into the wind, almost as if Mary were listening. They thought they could take it all. But they forgot roots run deeper than signatures. I turned back toward the farmhouse, its windows glowing softly in the dusk. Tomorrow, I'd wake before sunrise like always, feed the animals, walk the fields, and keep building on the only inheritance worth passing down, not money, not comfort, but the strength to endure. And as I stepped onto the porch, I knew one thing with unshakable certainty. An old man who has weathered storms his whole life cannot be underestimated. Because we know how to bend without breaking, how to fight without noise, and how to endure far longer than anyone believes. The farm was still mine, and so was my dignity.